Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Diep was recovering, slowly. Her face had color again. She could eat more than a few bites, and she didn't wake up every hour. But the trauma stayed close, hiding in ordinary sounds. The worst trigger wasn't thunder. It was rushing water. A neighbor washing buckets. A jar poured into a basin. The canal slapping the bank when the wind turned. The moment that sharp shh hit her ears, Diep would stiffen. Breath locked, hands cold, eyes going far away. Her mind didn't care that she was safe. It only remembered that she once wasn't. James noticed every time. No speeches, no pressure. He just stayed close. A hand on her shoulder, a warm drink, a quiet, "I'm here." And Ly had become a little guardian. Since the flood, she checked her mother constantly, as if watching could keep Diep from vanishing. At night, she'd whisper, "Mom, you promised you wouldn't disappear again." And Diep would hold her tight, ashamed that fear had moved into their home. One afternoon, the sky was bright and dry, but the canal still looked heavy with brown water. A gust pushed the surface against the bank. Harmless. And Diep flinched so hard she almost dropped the bowl in her hands. That was when James decided to change the rhythm. Because he could feel it. If they stayed indoors, the house would become a hiding place, and the hiding place would become a prison. The flood would be gone, but the flood would still be winning. He waited for a day that made sense. After a flood, the village always has cleanup day. Mud everywhere. Broken fences. Soggy rice sacks. It's exhausting. But it's also when the village becomes one big team, because nobody can do it alone. That morning, James came into the room while Diep folded clothes with careful, tired movements. Ly sat on the floor with pieces of chalk, lining them up like treasures. "They're cleaning up at the village square today," James said. Diep didn't look up. "I know. We should go." Her hand stopped. "No." James sat down nearby, not crowding her. "Not to talk," he said softly. "Not for anyone to ask questions, just to help. They helped us." Diep swallowed. Her eyes stayed on the fabric, but you could see the memories tugging. "I can't," she whispered. Ly scooted closer and grabbed Diep's hand with both of her small ones. "Now, let's go outside," she said, voice quiet but stubborn. "So Mom won't be afraid anymore." That sentence landed hard because it was too honest. Ly wasn't asking for fun. She was asking for her mom to come back. James added, "I'll be right there, the whole time." Diep looked at Ly, then at James. Her lips trembled like she wanted to argue, but she didn't have the energy. Finally, she nodded once, small, cautious, like she was testing the word yes. They walked together down the dirt road, Ly in the middle, holding both hands like a lifeline. Diep's steps were slow. James matched her pace without making a big deal of it. As they got closer, the village square sounded alive. Clanking pots, scraping shovels, voices calling to each other. The smell hit them next. Smoke, wet earth, and something warm like ginger and rice. Diep slowed at the edge. "You don't have to go all the way in," James murmured. "We can just stand here." Diep took a shaky breath and looked out. Everyone was doing something. Women poured rice into a huge pot on bricks while someone stirred with a paddle. Men hauled bamboo poles, rebuilding the bridge the flood had smashed. Teenagers shoveled mud into piles. Little kids carried tiny buckets, proud like they were moving mountains. A few heads turned when they noticed Diep. This was the part she feared, the attention, the pity, the questions. Her fingers started to tremble again. Then a voice called out, simple, normal, like greeting a neighbor. "Diep, you're here." Another person chimed in. "Good. You're standing. That's good." No one rushed her. No one demanded a story. They just made space. James grabbed a shovel and joined the mud line. Not to perform, just to show, "We belong here." Ly drifted toward the chalky corner where other children were doodling. But she kept glancing back, checking that her mom was still there. Diep hovered at the edge until a woman nearby held out a rag and nodded toward a stack of bowls. "If you want, you can help wipe these," the woman said. "Just sit. No rush." It was the gentlest kind of invitation. Diep hesitated, then sat on the bench. She took a bowl and wiped the rim. Then another. The repetition helped, hands moving, mind slowly following. Minutes passed. James kept stealing quick looks over his shoulder. He wasn't hovering, but he was tracking her like you track the edge of a storm, ready if it shifts. Each time Diep lifted her head and stayed present, he felt his chest loosen a little. Even Diep could feel it. Her breathing was still shallow, but it wasn't racing. The square had noise, yes, but it was the noise of work, not danger. And that difference mattered more than she expected. Around her, people talked about practical things, whose fence needed fixing, which field was still flooded, who had extra tarps. Normal problems. Normal voices. Diep glanced up and for the first time saw her hometown differently, not only as the place where danger happened, but as the place where people showed up anyway. Then Ly ran over, chalk dust on her fingers and cheeks. "Mom," she said, eyes bright, "can I draw something? Like our home?" Diep looked at her daughter, then at James. The question felt like a small bridge being offered. James stepped closer and asked the adults nearby, "Is it okay if she draws in a little corner? Just for a minute?" An older man laughed and waved his hand. "Let the child draw," he said. "Let her draw the sun back." "Draw the sun back." Ly tugged Diep's hand. "Come, stay with me." Diep stood up from the bench. Her legs felt shaky, but she took one step, then another, toward the chalk corner. The square didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt safer than she expected. Ly knelt and picked up a piece of chalk. "I'm gonna draw us," she announced, grinning. Diep opened her mouth to answer, maybe to laugh, maybe to say, "Okay, baby." And then it happened. A bucket tipped somewhere nearby and water poured fast into a ditch. A loud, sudden rush. Too close, too sharp. Diep's whole body seized. Her breath snapped in. Her eyes widened as the sound yanked her mind back toward the canal, back toward the reeds, back toward that cold moment where everything almost ended. James saw it instantly and moved, reaching for her hand as the water kept pouring. And that's where we'll stop for now, because the next beat isn't just about fear. It's about what happens when kindness meets fear face to face. The water poured for just a few seconds. One ordinary bucket. Yet in Diep's body, it sounded like the flood coming back. Her shoulders jumped. Her breath jammed in her throat. Ly froze with the chalk still in her hand. James moved fast but gently. He didn't grab her or make her feel like she was breaking. He stepped in close, slid his hand into hers, and anchored his voice where she could hear it. "Look at me," he said, low and steady. "You're here. It's a bucket, not the river." Diep tried to inhale. The air caught. Her eyes went wide, fixed on nothing. James didn't rush her. "Feel my hand," he murmured. "Squeeze once." Her fingers twitched, then squeezed, small, trembling, but real. Ly put the chalk down like it was fragile and wrapped both arms around her mom's waist. "It's okay, Mom," she whispered. "I'm here." A woman nearby noticed the tension and, without turning it into a show, called out to the man with the bucket, casual like it was about splashing. "Hey, pour slower near the kids, yeah?" "Sorry," he replied immediately, moving farther away. No staring, no gossip. People just adjusted and kept working. That simple response cracked something in Diep, because she'd been carrying this fear like a secret shame, expecting judgment. Instead, the village treated her like she belonged. Tears filled her eyes. She turned her face away, embarrassed, but they slipped out anyway. James stayed beside her, thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles. He didn't say, "Be strong." His silence said, "You're safe." Little by little, the panic eased. The bucket sound faded into the square's normal noise. Pots clanging, shovels scraping, voices calling. Diep's breathing steadied enough for her to stand without swaying. Ly looked up carefully. "Can I keep drawing?" she asked. Diep wiped her cheek and surprised herself by nodding. "Yes," she said. "Draw." Before Ly could sprint back to her chalk, James glanced around and raised a hand to the older men fixing the bridge. "Is it okay if she draws in a corner?" he asked. "Just something small." One of them waved him off with a grin. "Let her draw. After a flood, we need the kids to put the sun back." That line made a couple people chuckle, but it also softened the air around Diep. Nobody was treating their family like a tragedy. They were treating them like neighbors. Ly's smile returned like sunlight. She grabbed the chalk and knelt. First a house, crooked, honest. Then a roof, then 3 stick figures. "One is you," she said, tapping the tallest. "One is Dad, and this tiny one is me." She connected their hands with one long line, like that was the whole point. Then she drew a sun, huge and impossible to miss, rays shooting out like fireworks. Diep crouched beside her, knees shaky but present. She watched the chalk move and felt something loosen. Not the fear? Not yet. But the loneliness. James knelt down too, close enough to steady Diep if she wobbled, but not hovering. Ly leaned back to admire her drawing, then she turned and hugged her mother hard. "Look, Mom," she said, bright and certain. We still have everything." Those words hit Diep right in the chest. For days her mind had been circling one nightmare. What if I didn't come back? What if Ly grew up with a hole where her mother should be? But here was Ly, holding her like it was the simplest truth. "We're together. We're here." Diep's breath broke and a sob escaped. She covered her mouth, tears spilling. This time it wasn't fear, it was relief. An elderly woman approached quietly, small, sun-worn, eyes kind. In her hands was a jacket, clean, dry, neatly folded. She held it out. "Put this on," she said. "The wind turns cold near sunset." Diep took it with trembling hands. The old woman added, calm as a fact, "Your survival is a blessing to the whole village." Shattered the last wall inside Diep. Because she'd imagined blame. Instead, she was being welcomed back with dignity, like her being alive mattered. Diep managed a broken, "Thank you." The old woman patted her shoulder once and moved on, already helping someone else, as if kindness was simply part of the day. The afternoon rolled forward. Porridge was served in dented bowls, steam rising with the smell of ginger and rice. Diep found herself doing small tasks without thinking too hard, wiping bowls, handing a ladle to someone, folding wet cloths into a dry pile. Nothing heroic, just participating. And every time she did one small thing, the square answered with normalcy. A nod, a joke, someone saying, "Careful, it's hot," like she was simply part of the circle again. The bamboo bridge was tied back together. People laughed in tired little bursts that sounded like victory. Diep stayed. She still flinched at sudden splashes. She still glanced toward the canal. But she didn't run, and no one made her feel wrong for shaking. As the sun dipped lower, the square turned gold. Smoke from the cooking fire rose in thin ribbons. Ly's chalk sun glowed against the dirt like a tiny promise. "Dad," Ly said, tugging James's sleeve, "can we leave it here?" James smiled. "If the rain doesn't wash it away." Ly nodded. "We can draw it again." When the work finally slowed, James gathered their things without rushing deep. No big lesson, no forced optimism, just a quiet walk home. Ly ran ahead, chasing the last bright patches of light. Diep walked slower. James matched her pace. They passed the canal. The water was calmer now, still brown, but quiet enough to reflect the orange sky. Diep stopped at the edge of the field and looked out. The flood had left scars, flattened plants, debris and reeds, mud that would take time to heal. But the horizon was peaceful. Birds settled. The world kept going. For the first time since the flood, Diep didn't turn away. She didn't retreat into the house. She just stood there and breathed, feeling the solid ground under her feet like it was a new kind of proof. James reached out and held her hand. Not to pull her forward, not to push her past anything, just to say, "I'm here, take your time." Diep squeezed back, stronger this time. Ahead, Ly laughed, loud and free, sprinting down the path like the future belonged to her. Her laughter floated over the fields, light as the sunset. Diep watched her and whispered, almost like a promise, "I'm still here." James didn't answer with words. He stayed steady at her back, hand in hers, as the sky darkened slowly. And that was the milestone. Not a perfect ending where trauma disappears overnight, just a family stepping back into the world. One held hand, one chalk sun, one brave breath at a time. A warm ending, and the beginning of their revival. Diep's body heals after the flood, but the trauma lingers. Any sound of rushing water sends her into panic. Seeing her shrinking into fear, James chooses to change the rhythm by bringing Diep and Ly to the village cleanup day, hoping to repay kindness and help their family step back into life. Diep hesitates, terrified of judgment, but Ly holds her hand and insists they go so her mom won't be afraid anymore. At the village square, neighbors cook porridge, rebuild the bamboo bridge, and shovel mud with tired smiles. When a sudden splash triggers Diep, James and Ly ground her with gentle reassurance, and the village quietly adapts without shame. An elderly woman offers a dry jacket and calls Diep's survival a blessing, moving her to tears. Ly draws their home, 3 hands, a bright sun, reminding Diep they still have everything.